The worst part isn't the sound. It's the silence that comes right before it. A silence so deep and heavy it feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting. My own breath catches in my throat, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming to move, to do anything to break the stillness. But I can't. I have to stay perfectly still, because that's the rule. I don't know who made the rule or why, but I learned it the hard way. The floorboards only creak when I'm not moving. And in the suffocating darkness of the upstairs hallway, with a film of cold sweat slicking my skin and my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I am perfectly, terrifyingly still. I am a statue carved from fear, waiting for the sound that tells me I'm not alone, waiting for the sound that tells me something is coming. 6 months ago, this house was supposed to be a new beginning. It was a classic turn-of-the-century two-story in a quiet, leafy neighborhood of Portland, the kind of place you see in pictures of the idealized American dream. My ex-fiancée, Chloe, and I had picked it out together. We walked through its empty rooms, our voices echoing off the plaster walls, and planned our whole lives. We pointed out where the couch would go, where we'd hang the painting we bought on our trip to the coast, which room would be my office, and which one someday might be a nursery. It had what the real estate agent called good bones and charming character. What that really meant was that it was old. The floors were original Douglas fir, worn smooth in the high-traffic areas and groaning under the slightest pressure. The windows were single-paned and rattled when the wind blew. The whole place smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and a century of other people's lives. Then Chloe left. It wasn't dramatic, no big fight. It was a slow, quiet erosion like water wearing down stone. One day we were planning a future, and the next she was packing her things into boxes, telling me she loved me but she wasn't in love with me. And just like that, I was alone in a house meant for two. A house filled with the ghosts of a future that would never happen. The first few weeks were a blur of takeout containers, sleepless nights, and the hollow echo of my own footsteps. I'm a freelance architectural drafter, so my work is solitary by nature. I spend my days hunched over a drafting table or a computer screen, turning blueprints into detailed 3D models. It's quiet, meticulous work that requires long periods of intense focus. My office was the smaller bedroom upstairs, overlooking the backyard. I'd sit there for 8, sometimes 10 hours a day, the only sounds being the click of my mouse, the low hum of my computer, and the distant drone of traffic. The silence of the house was a constant, oppressive presence. It was a testament to my solitude, a physical manifestation of the empty space Chloe had left behind. Every creak and groan of the old structure felt like it was sighing with loneliness, right along with me. I learned the house's rhythms. The groan of the water pipes when the heat kicked on, the way the stairs would let out a series of pops in the evening as the temperature dropped, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs hall, a relic left by the previous owners that I hadn't had the heart to move. These were the normal sounds, the comforting, predictable language of an old home. They were the sounds of a house settling, of a structure breathing. I got used to them. They became part of the background noise of my new, solitary life. The first time it happened, I barely registered it. It was about 3 in the morning, a week or so after I'd finally unpacked the last of my own boxes. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind doing its usual late-night dance of replaying every mistake I'd ever made. The house was dead quiet. Not even the wind was blowing. I was completely still, caught in that strange, weightless state between exhaustion and anxiety. Creaked. The sound was sharp, distinct. It came from the hallway right outside my bedroom door. It was the sound of a single floorboard taking weight. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon in the attic, a squirrel. But the sound was too heavy for that. It was a human sound. My second thought, the one that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, was that someone was in the house. I lay there frozen for what felt like an hour. Every muscle in my body was tensed, my ears straining to catch another sound. Nothing, just the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock downstairs. After a long while, the fear began to subside, replaced by logic. The house is 100 years old, I told myself. It's just settling. The temperature is dropping, the wood is contracting. It's perfectly normal. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, the sound already fading into the category of a half-remembered dream. A few nights later, it happened again. Same circ. Instances. I was in bed, wide awake, perfectly still. The world outside was silent. And then that same deliberate sound from the exact same spot in the hallway, creak. This time the rationalizations didn't come as easily. It was too specific, too identical to the last time. It wasn't a random pop or groan. It was the distinct, drawn-out sound of a footstep. I got out of bed, my heart thumping, and crept to the door. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening. Silence. I slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open a crack. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint, silvery light of the moon coming through the window at the far end. Dust motes danced in the light. Nothing was out of place. I stood there for a long time, just listening, before finally convincing myself I was just stressed, sleep-deprived, and letting my imagination get the better of me. The incidents started to become more frequent, but the pattern remained maddeningly elusive at first. It wasn't a nightly occurrence. Sometimes a week would go by with nothing but the house's usual symphony of groans and pops. Then it would happen 2 nights in a row. It wasn't just at night either. One afternoon I was at my desk, deep in concentration. I was staring at my monitor, my hand hovering over my mouse, completely lost in the intricate details of a building's facade. I hadn't moved a muscle in at least 5 minutes. Creak. The sound came from the landing at the top of the stairs, just a few feet from my office door. It was so close, so clear, that I physically jumped in my chair. I whipped my head around to look at the open doorway, my heart racing. The landing was empty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor. I got up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out onto the landing. I put my full weight on the board I knew had made the sound. It groaned under my foot, the same sound, but not quite. The sound I'd heard was drier, more furtive. That's when the first inkling of the real pattern began to form in my mind. It was a thought so strange, so illogical, that I immediately tried to dismiss it, but it lingered. Every time I heard the sound, I had been completely, utterly still. Not just resting, but frozen, in thought, in fear, in the dead of night. I started to test the theory. It felt insane, like I was actively trying to prove my own delusion. I would sit on the couch in the living room and force myself to be motionless. I'd count the seconds in my head, focusing on not even twitching a finger. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The silence would stretch and deepen, becoming a tangible presence in the room. And just when the tension became unbearable, just when I was about to give up and move, creak, from the bottom of the staircase. I tried it again the next day in the kitchen. I stood by the counter, holding my breath, pretending to be a statue. The seconds ticked by on the microwave clock. After 93 seconds of absolute stillness, I heard it. A soft groan from the floorboards in the dining room just beyond the doorway. It was real. The pattern was real. The floorboards only creaked when I wasn't moving. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a new, colder kind of fear. A rational fear of an intruder is one thing. You can call the police, you can buy a weapon, you can install a security system. But what do you do with this? What do you do with a phenomenon that seems to be tied directly to your own state of being? It wasn't that the house was haunted. It felt more intimate than that. It felt like the house was aware of me. It was aware of my stillness, and it was responding to it. My life began to change. I, who had always cherished quiet and solitude, started to dread it. Silence was no longer peaceful. It was a trigger. It was the canvas upon which those sounds were painted. I started leaving the TV on all the time, even when I wasn't in the room, just for the background noise. I played music while I worked, something I'd never done before because it usually broke my concentration. But now, a broken concentration was a small price to pay for the illusion of safety. Sleep became the greatest challenge. Lying still in the dark was an open invitation. I tried to fall asleep with the TV on, but the flickering light was distracting. I bought a white noise machine, and it helped a little. It filled the silence with a steady, soothing hiss, but I knew Underneath the static, the silence was still there, waiting. And sometimes, on the worst nights, I would hear it. A faint, wooden protest, somehow managing to cut through the wall of white noise. It was a sound that now seemed to be tuned to a frequency only I could hear. The exhaustion was bone deep. I was living in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, my body perpetually tensed. I found myself developing nervous habits. I'd tap my foot constantly while I worked. I'd shift my weight from side to side when I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew. I couldn't just be still anymore. My body had learned that stillness was danger. The phenomenon began to escalate. It wasn't just a single, random creak anymore. It was becoming more complex. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading. I'd been motionless for a few minutes, absorbed in my book. I heard a creak from the bottom of the stairs. I ignored it, forcing my eyes to stay on the page. A few seconds passed. Then another creak from the third or fourth step. Then another, a little higher up. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a sequence. It was a progression. Something was coming up the stairs. I slammed the book shut and jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet house. The creaking stopped. The only answer was the ticking of the clock in the hall. I grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and crept towards the staircase. The bottom of the stairs was cast in shadow, but the landing above was lit by the setting sun. I could see all the way to the top. There was nothing there. I stood motionless at the bottom of the stairs for a full 10 minutes, a prisoner in my own home, waiting. But now that I was moving, now that my body was thrumming with adrenaline, the house was silent. It was only my own frantic breathing that filled the air. This incident marked a turning point. My anxiety curdled into genuine paranoia. I started to feel watched. When I walked through the house, I felt a pressure on my back, as if unseen eyes were following my every move. I'd whip my head around to look behind me and find only an empty room, shadows clinging to the corners. The house, which had once felt empty and lonely, now felt occupied, crowded. I was sharing my space with something I couldn't see, something that only made its presence known when I was at my most vulnerable, when I was still. I started checking the locks obsessively, 3-4 times before I went to bed. I'd walk through the house before turning in, opening closet doors, looking under the bed like a child afraid of monsters. But the monster I was afraid of wasn't hiding in the closet. It was hiding in the very fabric of the house itself. It was in the wood, in the air, in the silence. I thought about calling Chloe. I picked up my phone a dozen times, my thumb hovering over her name. What would I even say? "Hey, I know we haven't talked, but the house we were supposed to live in together is making strange noises, but only when I'm not moving." She'd think I was having a breakdown. She'd probably be right. The thought of her pity, of her thinking I'd lost my mind over her leaving, was more than I could bear. So I kept it to myself. The secret festered, isolating me even further. The sounds began to mimic me. This was the most disturbing development of all. One afternoon, I walked from my office to the bathroom at the end of the hall. I have a particular gait, and I know the music of my own footsteps on that hallway floor. There's a board right outside the guest room that always makes a high-pitched squeak, followed by two solid, low groans from the boards just before the bathroom door. Squeak, groan, groan. I'd walked that path 1,000 times. I went into the bathroom, washed my hands, and came back to my office. I sat down at my desk and got back to work. I fell into that state of deep focus again, my body becoming perfectly still as I manipulated a 3D model on the screen. Maybe 10 minutes passed. The house was dead quiet. And then I heard it, from the far end of the hall near my office door. Squeak, groan, groan. It was the exact sequence of sounds my own footsteps had made, a perfect phantom echo of my own passage down the hall. It was a sound played back to me by an unseen performer. It was a message. It was a way of saying, "I am here. I see you. I can do what you do." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just a presence anymore. This was an intelligence. It was learning. It was mocking me. I stopped sleeping almost entirely. I'd doze off in my chair in the living room with the TV blaring, only to be jolted awake an hour later by a phantom creak from the kitchen that sounded suspiciously like the board in front of the sink where I had stood earlier. The house was cataloging my movements, my habits, and playing them back for me during the silences. I was living in a cage with a ghost that was building a perfect replica of me, one footstep at a time. My work suffered. My clients called asking where the drafts were. I couldn't focus. I couldn't sit still long enough to get anything done. My mind was a constant, frantic loop of fear and speculation. My physical health deteriorated. I lost weight. Dark, bruised-looking circles formed under my eyes. I looked haunted because I was. I knew I had to leave. I started looking at apartments online, sterile new builds with concrete floors and thin walls where you could hear your neighbors arguing. The thought of leaving the house I'd put so much hope into felt like a monumental failure, but the thought of staying was infinitely worse. But before I could leave, I felt I had to do one last thing. I had to confront it. Not to fight it, not to banish it, but just to understand, to see how far it would go. It was a terrible, self-destructive impulse, born of sleep deprivation and a desperate need for some kind of certainty, even a terrifying one. I needed to know what I was running from. That night, I decided to conduct one final experiment. I waited until after midnight. A storm had rolled in and rain lashed against the windows, but around 2 a.m. it passed, leaving a profound, dripping silence in its wake. The air was thick and heavy. I turned off every light in the house, except for the small lamp on the end table in the downstairs living room. It cast a weak, watery glow up the staircase, just enough to prevent the upstairs hallway from being in absolute, pitch-black darkness. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My palms were slick with sweat. I took off my slippers, wanting my feet to be bare on the wood. I walked to the end of the upstairs hallway, the end furthest from the stairs, and stood with my back against the wall, facing the long, dark corridor. My bedroom was to my right, my office to my left. Down the hall were the guest room and the bathroom. The pale light from downstairs didn't reach this far. It only illuminated the top few stairs, leaving the rest of the hallway as a cavern of shadows. My plan was simple. I was going to stand there. I was going to be more still than I had ever been in my life, and I was going to wait. I was going to give it the perfect, silent stage it seemed to crave. The first few minutes were an agony of anticipation. Every drip of water from the eaves outside sounded like a gunshot. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs felt like a roar. My own breathing was a hurricane in my ears. I forced myself to control it, slowing it down, making it as shallow and quiet as possible. I focused on a point in the darkness at the far end of the hall, and I did not move. I locked my knees, clenched my fists at my sides, and waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. 10 minutes. The muscles in my legs began to tremble with the strain. A desperate, hysterical thought bubbled up. I am crazy. I've done this to myself. It's all in my head. The disappointment was so sharp it almost felt like relief. I was about to give up, to let out the breath I was holding and retreat to the relative safety of my lit-up living room. That's when I heard it. Creak. It was a low, complaining groan. It came from the far end of the hall, from the floorboard right at the top of the stairs, where the faint light met the deep darkness. It was the first step. I remained frozen, a statue of ice. The sound wasn't an echo of a step I had taken. I hadn't been to that end of the hall. This was new. This was an original composition. A long, drawn-out silence followed. It stretched for what must have been a full minute. The weight of it pressed in on me, suffocating me. I could feel the pulse in my neck, a frantic, terrified rhythm. Crack! The sound was sharper this time, closer. A different board, maybe 10 feet from the first one. It was the sound a nail makes when it shifts in old, dry wood. A pause, another minute of unbearable silence. I was trying to place the sounds, to map them out in my head. I knew these floors, I knew their voices. This was the sound of a slow, deliberate walk. The steps were too far apart, the cadence all wrong for a person. It was a patient, measured, and unnatural progression. Grewin. Closer still. Now it was just outside the guest room door. This one was a deep, resonant sound like a cello string being plucked. I could almost feel the vibration of it through the soles of my bare feet. My vision started to swim. Black spots danced at the edges. I realized I was barely breathing. I had to force myself to draw in a slow, shaky breath, the sound of it seeming to tear through the silence. The creaking stopped. Did my breath scare it? Did it know I was aware? I waited, my entire being focused on the darkness in front of me. I could just make out the dark rectangle of the guest room doorway. Nothing moved. There was no shape, no shadow within the shadow. There was only the sound. And then it came again, a soft, high-pitched squeak. The board right outside the guest room. My board, the one that always squeaked when I walked past. Squeak, groan, groan, it knew. It was performing my song for me. My sanity, already frayed, felt like it was about to snap. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn on every light in the house and flood the darkness away. But I couldn't. Fear had paralyzed me. My feet felt nailed to the floor. I was a spectator at my own haunting. The next sound was the first groan. It was halfway between the guest room and WH. Ere I stood. It was so close now, so impossibly close. The air in the hallway grew cold, a damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I could feel the fine hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stand on end. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't bear to look into the darkness anymore. I just listened. The final groan. It was a deep, guttural sound, and it came from the floorboard directly in front of my office, no more than 6 feet away from me. It was right there. Whatever it was standing right there in front of me in the dark. I could feel it. I couldn't see it or smell it or hear it breathing, but I could feel its presence like a static charge in the air, a pressure against my skin. We stood there facing each other in the darkness. An eternity seemed to pass in that silence. My heart felt like it was going to explode. The silence was absolute, deeper than it had ever been before. It was a vacuum, pulling all sound, all thought, all hope out of the world. And then the final sound. It wasn't in front of me. It was beneath me. The very floorboards I was standing on let out a long, slow, agonizing creak, as if an immense and impossible weight had just been placed upon them. A weight that settled right where I stood. It was the sound of the house itself buckling under a strain it was never meant to bear. The sound was so loud, so close, it was inside my head. It vibrated up through my bones, a deep, resonant frequency of pure terror. And I felt nothing. No touch, no breath, no push, just the sound. The sound of something sharing the exact same space that I was, standing in the exact same spot, its invisible feet on the same boards as mine. That's when I broke. A raw animal sound tore from my throat. I didn't even recognize it as my own voice. I threw myself backward, my shoulders hitting the wall hard. I scrambled, crab-walking away, my hands slapping against the wooden floor. I found the doorknob to my bedroom, wrenched it open, and fell inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled for the lock and threw the deadbolt. I collapsed against the door, gasping, sobbing, my body shaking uncontrollably. I stayed there, huddled on the floor, until the sun came up, listening. But the house was silent again. The performance was over. I didn't wait. As soon as the sun was fully up, I grabbed my keys, my wallet, my phone, and I ran. I got in my car, still in my pajamas and bare feet, and I drove. I ended up in the parking lot of an all-night diner an hour away and sat there, shaking, until the morning rush started. I never spent another night in that house. I called a moving company that specialized in emergency clearouts. I paid them an exorbitant amount of money to pack up my entire life and put it in storage. I told them the pipes had burst and the place was being condemned, a lie that felt less insane than the truth. I sat in my car across the street and watched them go in and out, carrying boxes filled with my books, my clothes, the ghost of the life Chloe and I were supposed to have. When they were done, I drove the key to the rental agency, dropped it in their mail slot, and never looked back. It's been over a year now. I live in a new apartment on the 7th floor of a concrete high-rise. There are no creaking floorboards here. There is only the hum of the air conditioning, the rush of traffic from the street below, and the muffled sounds of my neighbors' lives bleeding through the walls. It's not a quiet place, and I've made sure of it. But the silence is still there. It follows me. I can't sleep without a TV, a fan, and a podcast all playing at once. I can't work without music blasting in my headphones. I can't stand in a quiet room for more than a few seconds before the anxiety starts to crawl up my spine. I have a constant, nervous energy. I tap my feet, I drum my fingers, I pace. I can't be still. I'm terrified of what might happen if I am. Sometimes, late at night, when there's a lull in the city's noise, I can almost feel it. That deep, expectant hush. That feeling of being observed by an invisible audience. And I wonder if it was the house, or if it was something that was drawn to my grief, to my solitude. Or, and this is the thought that keeps me awake more than any other, I wonder if it was something that I woke up inside myself. Something that has followed me here. I don't have any answers. There was no resolution, no explanation. I simply ran. I live in a fortress of noise, a prisoner of motion. But I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that it's still out there. Waiting. Waiting for a moment of perfect, absolute stillness. Waiting for me to stop moving so it can start again.